This one, Retina II Big C. Now the Retina II Big C camera is a very popular model, quite sought after. The owner of this one tells me that he was using it in very cold weather and suddenly it didn't want to do anything useful. He was even having trouble getting the front to close. So it is quite stiff. The film advance does not feel nice and it sticks out at a funny angle. Now all of that points to probably the shutter cocking rack being toast. So let's open it up and find out what the story is. Spin that rewind knob off. Single screw at the end of the top cover. 2 screws here that were underneath the rewind knob. They're all chrome brass. You've got to be careful with those not to chew them up because people will be able to see where you've been. Top cover, a little bit of sand and grit in there, quite a bit. Oh, some insect remains in there too. That's not the shape of grains of sand. And what have we got here? Well, let's clear a little bit of the overburden off. That's our film release button and its spring. And we can take the shutter release button off, but I didn't pull the shaft out. Now the back's a bit stiff to close. What's happening with this cocking rack then? Oh, did you see that? As soon as I started moving the film advance lever, watch the cocking rack at this point. Yeah, did you see that jump? I think that the cocking rack or the transfer shaft is damaged at this end. This is all uniformly filthy in here. The head of this screw here is quite chewed up, as are these ones. So I think someone's been in here previously. Now, why were they in here and what did they achieve? Well, there are 2 shim washers underneath the strap lug. That's nothing particularly sinister. Sometimes you need those to get things to run smoothly. Let's strip that rangefinder out of the way, give ourselves some breathing space. Oh yeah, that's it's pretty sandy under here. Yeah, a little bit of filth in that rangefinder. Okay, let's have a look at this. So I'm going to remove that strap lug. Now I've got a screwdriver that I modified years ago. Basically I just cut the end off it, put it in the lathe, bored a hole down the middle of it, clearance for that shaft, then cut a slot across the end of it to engage the flats on that little post, that post being the guide post for the film release button. And we have 2 screws here. Often you'll find only 1 screw in that position, holding these down. Now there's another shim washer here on that bracket, which I'll carefully put to one side because shim washers are easily lost. Let's have this out. And let's see if we can see anything here. Well, the teeth here, I can see they're quite burred up. Those last three teeth are they've got quite a burr over them. Yeah, one of them, looking down from the top, I can see that the teeth are damaged here. There's a chip of metal right in there. That tooth has been folded over and damaged. So that rack, I think, has had its day. Yeah, there's just a little flake of metal there, brass. Almost certainly that was off the rack. So I think that rack's had it. The teeth look, oh, yeah, they're not the right shape. They should be uniform. They should be quite steep-sided. By the time you get down to here, you can see that these teeth look like very, very rounded hills. They don't have the proper peak at all. So that cocking rack has had the biscuit. That's just shot. Why did it die? Well, there's a lot of reasons that shutter cocking racks will die, of course. Generally it comes down to problems elsewhere. So when the teeth are stripped at the top of the cocking rack, sometimes it can be because this shoulder screw here is loose and it's allowed the rack to push away from this gear, and so things don't happen correctly. Sometimes if this screw and this screw are loose, the whole shaft here at the top's been allowed to move. And you can see there's a bit of wiggle room in there. That tells me that the bush is probably quite worn. Now as that shaft pushes away, obviously the teeth of the rack, let's put it back in place. As the shaft pushes away, you'll find that the gap between here, the backlash, grows to such an extent that the teeth are only touching right on the very tips. And when they're doing that, they, well, effectively they haven't got enough strength behind them, and the tips will shear off and it's gone. Any stiffness in the action from this point towards the shutter will obviously load up the teeth here. It'll require this part to do more work. There'll be more force required to move it. And the stiffness that you get, where does it come from? Well, it certainly comes from this sort of behaviour, this built up sticky grease and grit and dust. That creates an awful lot of drag, so that the action has a very hard job to pull this rack forward in order to turn the shaft that runs through here and cocks the shutter. Any resistance in the shutter itself to the cocking action will also load up the cocking rack and cause it to fail. Since the teeth have gone at this point, we know that this point is probably irrelevant. We don't need to worry about what was happening there. That probably didn't have any bearing on it at all. But something from here on in did. Now various things can happen there. As I mentioned previously, unusual load from the shutter, that would certainly do it. And how do you get unusual loads in the shutter? Dried out grease. That would be a major concern. Stuff that's greasy that shouldn't be greasy. And we did have one clue with this, and that's that the camera was pulled out to be used on a very cold day. And what that means is that any grease that was in there, the viscosity would be very high. It would, instead of being nice and runny like oil, it would be thick like tar. And that means that anything that was coated in that grease, it would be very hard to move it. It would not want to slide over the surfaces. The tar would be holding it back. And any extra load means that worn out pieces like this are just that much closer to failure. So definitely a shutter cocking rack. The rack itself, well, it was worn. Everything here is a little bit worn. The camera's had an interesting life, I would say. But the main thing here is that everything is uniformly filthy and that grease is very thick and dried. And that's what will do it every time. So had the camera been cleaned, had it been freshly serviced with nice clean lubricants where required and as required, it's very likely that rack would not have failed. Well, not now. It might have failed at some stage in the future when it had really been pushed past its limit. But for the moment, I wouldn't have expected that to collapse. There's another indication of something odd here. That door should stick out at about 90 degrees from the body, where you can see it's got a bit of a sweep in that way. That means it's been bent. How do they get bent? Well, when the door doesn't want to close and someone pushes it, that'll bend it. If the camera gets dropped when the door is open, that'll bend it too. But something has bent it, and these arms, top and bottom, they're probably somewhat bent. When they're bent, what it does is it changes the distance that the lens standard gets pushed back into the body. One of the things that happens is that when those arms are bent, it pushes that back so far into the body. In fact, you can see it here, I think. You can. It pushes it back so far into the body. That's the back of the here and here, that's the back of that lens standard. You can see it's been pushed so far back in the body it would be jamming up against that cocking rack. So of course if you start swinging the cocking rack at that position, you would find that it's got an undue amount of resistance and something would not want to work. So yeah, there's contributing factors here. What can we say about the camera apart from that? The lens looks like it's got a little bit of cleaning marks to it. I don't think that would be a major issue. I don't see any serious problem with Zeiss bumps on it, so we haven't got a serious corrosion problem there most likely. I'm reasonably confident the shutter will need servicing, because shutters, it used to be said that a shutter needed to be serviced every 5 years or so to be in top condition. Now obviously that was probably a bit of an exaggeration, and you could probably get away with a decade without service, or 15 years, or maybe even 20. But who knows when the last time this shutter was serviced. There are no repair stickers inside to tell us anything interesting. Looking at that rear lens group, there's something in there. Looks like it's on the inner surface. I don't know what it is. Hopefully it's a little thread of cotton or something. We'll find out, no doubt. That doesn't want to close properly. That could be an issue. Yeah, certainly needs a bit of encouragement. Okay, well I'll pull this thing to pieces and clean everything up, put it back together, fit a new shutter cocking rack. Hopefully I don't have to replace the shaft, and this should go back to its owner. All good to go, ready for decades more service, and after that it won't be my pigeon. Well, I've just about got this thing stripped right down. This is the transfer shaft that the cocking rack runs on. This takes the action from the cocking rack through to the front of the camera. A little fleck of brass just came off that. I think it's probably one of the teeth from the cocking rack, but I'll be looking much closer at this once I've got it clean, because at the moment it's covered in filthy grease, like all of these components, and you can see how much sand is in here. Well, as you can imagine, sand doesn't do wonders for mechanisms either. So just getting these last few little bits and pieces apart. And I'll sort these pieces out, and they are going to need an extended wash, I think, in the ultrasonic cleaner, because my hands are just covered in grit. It's come off things, grease and grit. I did think that perhaps the camera hadn't been serviced before. That proved not to be the case, because I could tell from the state of the leatherette from the bottom of the camera that had been glued back at some stage in the past. Okay, well, this greasy dirty mess here is going to require a bit of attention, I think. Bring all these pieces in where we can see them. Oh yeah, on top of that, of course, we've got this, the top cover and so forth. But this lot is all going to have to be cleaned. It's terrible at the moment. My hands are covered in grease and they're covered in grit. There's a nasty feeling. All of this has got to be cleaned before it can go back together. Well, I've got these parts back from the ultrasonic cleaner now, and they're nice and sparkly clean, and I can see exactly what I've got. And the teeth here are very damaged. It's on the lower part of the rack. On the upper part of the rack, they're also damaged here, here and here. Those teeth, there's a group of 4 of them there. They're all pointing at an angle like that instead of sitting square to the rack. So that rack has really had it. These teeth at this end, I could probably push them back into shape. These ones at the bottom here, because that metal's gone, that would be where those chips of brass came from. There's nothing to push back into shape. Where teeth are bent over a little bit, as long as all the metal's there, you can push it back to where you want it to be, by and large. I can't do anything with that, that's just too far gone. But the piece it couples to, this piece here, well, that's nice and clean now, and I can look at that, and those teeth appear good. I don't believe there's a problem with those teeth. I think they'll be fine. Likewise, this piece here, this is the gear from the top of the film advance shaft that couples to the upper part of the rack. Again, those teeth look good to me. They're not distorted. They don't appear to be damaged in any way. So I think this nice pile of clean parts here will probably reassemble into a useful camera, just providing as long as I put a new shutter cocking rack in it. But it's the end of the week, it's beer o'clock, and I'm stopping. I'll clean up this top cover. It certainly doesn't need an awful lot of work. Be very careful with these chromed brass screws on the accessory shoe. They scar up very easily. You don't want to slip with your screwdriver, otherwise you will bitterly regret it. As you can see, there's a lot of dirt there underneath that shoe, and this little patch right here is corrosion. That's not going to go away. That'll be where moisture has got under the chrome. Very possibly as a result of saltwater damage or something like that. Just a splash, it only takes a drop of something to settle on the surface, and the the goodness of that salt will set up corrosion that'll last for years. There's corrosion visible here, here and here, 3 small spots. It's quite normal around the bottom edge. That's where the top cover tucks down into the chrome trim on the top of the body. This is quite clean really. I'm just cleaning the number dial here. The frame counter. This is just open really, so it gathers up dust and dirt. Sometimes, particularly if it's been sitting somewhere unfortunate for a long time, you'll end up with one small patch of this looking much uglier than the rest. Just trying my best here to get this as clean as possible. This can't be disassembled to get that disc out. This piece here is crimped in. You would need a replacement, and I don't recall that they were ever available as a spare part by themselves. Right, the front windows here, I'm going to slide those out. Those 2 pieces of glass slide out quite easily for cleaning. And I can clean the front panel there around those frames. It's worth getting those frames there quite clean before you put your cleaned glass back, otherwise you'll end up with smears around the edges if you put your clean glass back into a dirty, greasy frame. A little bit of dust and grit in the back here. I'll make sure I clean all that out. And here I'm just using Naphtha. The frame counter components here, you can see the underside. Now this is where that little hole that you see, let's zoom you in a bit. That's better, now we can see what we're talking about. That little square hole there, that's where the pin rises up when you reach frame number 1, and the lock lever rises up, and that of course locks the film advance at the base of the camera. Now this is a little bit greasy of course, there's a bit of grease on that, and that typically gathers up dust as a result, and grit sometimes. So it's worth checking that this removes fairly smoothly. If it doesn't, you may need to flush this whole piece out with Naphtha and work it repeatedly. Make sure that you get any grit and rubbish out of there. If this mechanism is unduly stiff, zoom you back out, what you end up with is extra stress on the film advance mechanism, and that will of course load up the shutter cocking rack, and you don't need any extra problems with the shutter cocking rack, because you can see that filth coming off there washing out. That's grit and dust from that frame counter. And you can see I've got the top cover lifted up so that any naphtha runs down towards the end of the camera down here where I can mop it up. I don't want it running into the rear eyepiece lens, which would be a bother and a nuisance, because I end up with greasy smears in there that I'd have an awful job trying to get rid of. But all that grit and rubbish just washed out of here. There's still a little bit more in there, I can feel it. The frame counter can also be stiff if the top cover is distorted, and typically it becomes distorted through drop damage, through something thumping on the top and distorting the top of the camera so that the frame counter mechanism here won't revolve smoothly. That feels much better now, that's good. I'll have to blow all that out. I'll need all of that naphtha and the old oil that it's carrying with it out of there. So I'll make it my business to blow that out and be back.